The fifth album for Quiet Riot was in many ways the beginning of the end. Ego, drugs, desperation, all of which fueled a pretty poorly received album. Even the title, QR3, makes absolutely no sense. So since it's been a few decades since I've even heard this album, thought I'd take a stab at it. So you know what you should do? You should stick around. So my personal history with this album was that I bought it when it was brand new back in 1986, minimally liked a couple of the tracks, but the rest of it was kind of underwhelming. Admittedly, this was a rather strange time for this band. They had two highly successful albums before this, the first of which more than the second, to be honest. This is also in the mid-1980s when a lot of bands went more commercial. Think Motley Crue, think Judas Priest. Some of that commerciality is also reflected in their change in wardrobe. Where you can see here, they're more in sort of these dressy 80s pop rock outfits, contrasted, of course, with the back of Metal Health, where you can see that they're doing more of the sort of leather and muscle shirts thing, a little more heavy metal. So change was coming, and this was it. Of course, some other changes happened in the band. They had already lost their bass player, Rudy Sarzo. He went on to the Mars Project and later to Whitesnake. He was replaced by Chuck Wright. Chuck was in the band before Rudy as the bass player. They kind of basically brought him back. Chuck's a decent bass player, but he's no Rudy Sarzo. In fact, Sarzo's lack of presence on this record is kind of obvious. I mean, Sarzo's a great bass player. If you've heard his stuff in the other bands, you know he's amazing and a very underrated bass player. I'm not just saying that as a bass player, he's pretty spectacular. So him not on this record, kind of miss him. He wasn't really a songwriter so much. Cavazzo and Dubrow mostly wrote a lot of the material, so he's not missing in that respect, but playing-wise, he's not here. I'm going to say it. I miss him. Of course, this is also the time period in which Quiet Riot's popularity was on the decline. Their album sales were showing it. There are no cover songs on this album, interestingly enough. I think people got used to them doing Slade songs. Of course, on Metal Health, it was Come On Feel the Noise, and on Condition Critical, it was Mama, We're All Crazy Now. So, no cover songs to rely upon, for better or worse. Of course, another big problem with Quiet Riot at this time was the massive ego of their lead singer, Kevin Dubrow. Basically, at this point, everyone hated Kevin. Bands hated him, fans hated him, music journalists certainly hated him. If you were reading Circus and Hit Parader at the time, they're filled with stories about everyone in the world versus Kevin Dubrow. The guy was a loudmouth, he talked a lot of crap about people and a lot of bands, and yeah, Kevin even thought that Quiet Riot was as big as the Beatles at some point, which is completely outrageous. But, you know, that's probably why they kicked him out of this band a year later, because they did get rid of him. In fact, they abandoned him in a hotel room somewhere out west. They just left without him, which is pretty funny. Now, I do remember QR3 being a bit poppier than previous efforts, which reminds me, in a previous episode of this show, I covered Judas Priest's Turbo album, and I mentioned that because I do find some correlations between Turbo and QR3. Both, of course, came out in 1986. They came out a few months apart. Both have a connection to CBS Records. Both bring in synth elements into the music. There's some other similarities. I'm going to go through those later as I go into the tracks. So given that I haven't heard this album since the 1980s, I thought I'd give it a revisit on this show, see how I feel about it. So with that, let's get to the track by track. So starting with track 1 on side 1, we have Main Attraction. And right away, the synth intro and the electronic drums are kind of off-putting. Also, one vibe I get from this track, this one as well as some of the other more upbeat tracks here, is that there's kind of this 80s teen comedy soundtrack vibe going on with it. I'm thinking a lot of the Savage Steve Holland directed films of the 80s, like Better Off Dead and One Crazy Summer. You kind of can imagine this track being a bit of a background to like a montage in one of those movies. And I don't think Quiet Riot was aiming for a teen comedy vibe from this song, but I think with all the synth elements and the poppy upbeatness of it, it has that quality to it, at least for me. So that's what I get stuck in my head when I hear this, and I don't know. Crazy. So a lot of synth flourishes in this track unnecessarily. Also, the guitar solo is a bit tame. It's a bit held back. I really feel on this record, this track and some of the other tracks especially, Carlos Cavazzo is being held on a leash at this point, maybe in production or wherever, but he's just not playing to full capacity. I mean, there were some amazing riffs on those other albums before this. This album is lacking that. and in the delivery as well. Funny thing is, this probably could have been a better Journey song than a Quiet Riot song. Journey, or maybe even the Steve Perry solo project, if we want to get that poppy. Yeah. So not as catchy as some of the other tracks on this album, and like a lot of the tracks though, the choruses are the strongest things in the song. I kind of wonder if they wrote all the choruses first and then built the rest of the songs around those choruses, but yeah, the rest of the songs don't really compare to a lot of the choruses, and that's pretty much a pattern on this album. So ultimately this song is half and half for me. Moving on to track 2, this is The Wild and the Young. It opens with drums, electronic reverby drums again. Thankfully, Frankie has real drums, alternating with electronic drums, unfortunately, in this album, so it's not a total loss. This is also the first single from this album. Not a bad song. It's probably the most well-known song on QR3. It also had a music video, a rather dystopian music video. You should probably check that out when you have the chance. It's kind of fun. So the track is pretty catchy despite some of the annoying instrumentation. I should also mention Kevin DuBro's vocals on this album. They're probably the best they've ever been, despite the fact that they are crippled by some of the music that's going on. His voice is really fantastic. And I think it's the shining star on this record is his voice. And were he not to be dead of a cocaine overdose, I'm sure he'd be pleased to no end to hear that, at least his ego. So if they had ditched the synth and heavied this track up a little bit, I think it really would have put this track up there with a couple of their previous hits. I'm not saying that lightly. Inherently, this is a good track. Moving on to track 3, we have Twilight Hotel. Starts with an acoustic guitar intro and wind chimes. Yes, wind chimes. Sure. This is also one of the ballads on the album, one of 3 ballads. I'm not sure why the album needs 3 of them, but here you go. There was also a music video for this track. It's an okay video, but not exactly compelling, but you can watch it. It's fine. Admittedly, the track is fairly cheesy, but it does have a rather endearing quality to it. In fact, even I feel a little bit torn when I hear it because I think to myself, should I be liking this song? Because I think I kind of do. So that's kind of funny. Also, Kevin's voice is fantastic on this. I really think he's trying to make lemonade out of lemons at this point, and I think he's largely succeeding. I think he is, again, the best thing about this track in particular, and a couple others. Given that, the chorus on this track is pretty good, as it is on a lot of other tracks, but the guitar solos are kind of tame again. They sound very soft rock sounding. Again, this is Cavazo on a leash, and it shows. So purely for the hooks and the overall song structure, I'm going to give this one a hesitant yes. Moving on to track 4, we have Down and Dirty. Starts off with a really heavy, great guitar lead-in. Then it gets pretty weak in the verses, and then it gets strong in the choruses. Again, that's a bit of a pattern here. Overall, this track's pretty up and down. So definitely a bit of a sleazy rocker track. Vibe-wise, I'm kind of reminded of Motley Crue and the Girls, Girls, Girls era. It definitely has that vibe to it. I mean, the song's called Down and Dirty. It should give you a little bit of an impression just from the title alone. This track does have a little more synth, of course, than Motley Crue is dealing with, so there's that. So the track is occasionally hooky, but in a poppy way. Also, the main guitar solo is considerably better than some of the others on this album, so that's a bit of a plus. Overall, it's not a bad track, but it's not a great track either. Moving on to track 5, this is Rise or Fall. Starts with a guitar riff that sounds like a Judas Priest riff. In fact, it sounds like a riff that could be found on Turbo. So yes, we're going to talk about that now. I mean, this does sound like a Quiet Riot song inherently, but it also sounds like it's borrowing from Turbo a bit. I don't know if that's necessarily a coincidence. Maybe it is. Turbo, of course, came out 3 months before QR3, but Turbo also was out 4 weeks before they stopped recording, so they had some time to hear the album. And of course, CBS Records is a connection between Judas Priest and Quiet Riot at this time, so maybe the suits at CBS were like, maybe you should sound a little bit more like this. Look how well Turbo's doing. Quiet Riot could do that well too. Or maybe someone in the band looked at the success of that album, and it was a successful album. Turbo did kind of well, so maybe they thought they could replicate that. In either case, there are some similarities in sound, especially on this track. And again, catchy chorus, very Quiet Riot in a lot of ways, but the rest of the song, not as strong. Again, you're going to hear that from me over and over again. Either way, I'm half and half about this. Flipping over to side 2, we have track 6, Put Up or Shut Up. Starts with a very turbo-sounding riff, again, undeniably so. But one of the cool things right away with this track is that they lay off the synth compared to all the other songs, so kudos to that. So this track also has a sleazy rocker vibe like the track on side 1, though I think it's a little more effective here. The choruses are catchy once again. The guitar solo is really great, really heavy. Overall, this sounds like a traditional Quiet Riot song, which is a good thing. One observation I made is that this song has much the same vibe as Party All Night, which is a track from Condition Critical. In fact, it was a minor hit and a music video from that album. I'm getting that same vibe, and I really like that. I think that's a positive for this track. So yeah, I dig this track. It's a keeper. Moving on to track 7, we have Still of the Night. No, not a Whitesnake cover song. This is their own. Starts once again with an acoustic intro and wind chimes. Goddamn wind chimes. Also, this is a power ballad, yet another power ballad on this album. Again, why? Now, I do like Dubrov's vocal melody choices here, but the chorus really does smack of mid-80s pop ballad, and the bass synth doesn't help either. Of course, I'm going to say it again, you can hear that if the instrumentation was changed, it was heavied up a bit, this would have been an inherently better track. Oddly enough, I'm also reminded of Night Ranger here. Not the Night Ranger that started out as hard rock, but more of the sort of the AOR pop stuff they did later. This could have easily been that incarnation of Night Ranger here. This song smacks of that. The guitar solo is decent, albeit pretty short. There is a part of me that wants to really like this song, but most of me really doesn't, so this is definitely a no. Moving on to track 8, we have Bass Case, which is really a very short instrumental. It's a bass solo. Actually, it's bass synth with some keyboard synths. It's synth all the way through. And I'm wondering what they're trying to do is maybe reference Battle Axe from Metal Health. That was a short guitar solo that kind of intros a song as well. This one intros a song, but this is no Battle Axe. It is nowhere near that great, and it's kind of unnecessary. So this is a no. Moving on to track 9, we have The Pump, and right away I'm noticing that intro synth flourish that happens at the very beginning of the track is suspiciously identical to the one in Tom Sawyer from Rush. And I don't know why there would be an homage to Rush, because this isn't a prog band, they sound nothing like Rush, they sound nothing like Tom Sawyer. But it's there, it's very strange, and you know where you've heard it before. It's like a Wilhelm scream, you know? So I'm hearing that, and I don't know why that's there at all. This track has a bit of a funk or boogie to it. It's also kind of invoking a sleazy rocker vibe to it again. Kevin DuBrow also in the verse parts does a little bit of a rap thing, which is kind of annoying and kind of unnecessary. I know he's trying to go along with the sort of funk bass thing that's going on here, but man, I don't know if I want that from Quiet Riot. You know what? I don't want that from Quiet Riot. Let me be definitive about that. So I do hear parts that are more of a slower groove, and it seems like that groove is trying to be heavy at times, but it's just not working. Also, we have female backup vocals on occasion. They're kind of R&B soul kind of a thing, but they seem really tossed in like a lot of other elements in this song. This song's a bit of a smorgasbord that no one really wants. It's kind of a mixed up kind of thing. Interestingly enough, the ender has a guitar solo that sounds a lot like Bruce Kulick. I'm definitely thinking Asylum and Crazy Nights era of Kiss. And that's kind of cool, but it really doesn't save this track at all. So this is a no. Moving on to track 10, we have Slave to Love, again, acoustic intro with some synth flourishes. This really has a standard pop rock vibe to it overall. I'm thinking Night Ranger and Rick Springfield and Pat Benatar. I'm definitely not thinking Quiet Riot. And those bands I reference are more early 80s than 1986. So I'm wondering why they're doing that. It would have been interesting for them to copy a band like Whitesnake. I mean, if they wanted that template. Of course, that album was a year later, so they couldn't. But man, you know, you could just tell how lost this band is, even in this song. So this one is another power ballad. This one's a little more mid-pace than the other two, but it's still pretty ballady. DuBrow's voice, of course, is excellent on this song. It is the best part of the song, and I know I sound like a broken record saying that, but it's true. The guitar solo is very synth processed, like overly processed in that regard, giving it more of a soft rock vibe, especially of that time. And again, don't know why you're going that direction. Female backup vocals in this track again, very soulful, but again, it feels tossed in, it's unnecessary. Again, another signpost that this band is a bit lost. So, gotta say no to this one as well, obviously. Moving on to track 11, we have Helping Hands. There's a lot of traditional Quiet Riot group vocals going on here. I kind of dig that. The lyrics are kind of lame. The vocal melody is a tad predictable, even though Kevin DuBro's voice quality is excellent. So mixed bag, of course. The pre-choruses here are pretty lame. They do lead into strong choruses with a lot of that standard Quiet Riot sing-along quality. It's one of the great things about this band is they have those great catchy choruses that you want to sing along to. I think that's intentional in this song. I think that's why this song is the final track on the album. Of course, also very synth-laden. Even the synth solo, yes, there is a keyboard synth solo, is very unnecessary and it's a little cringy. I am really of two minds about the guitar sound in this track. I think the riff is decent, but it's really muffled by a lot of effects, real overloading of layered effects, so I'm not digging that. There is a breakdown in this song, which is a very dramatic device, definitely used in final tracks a lot of the time, so I get why it's there. Still fun, still adds to the track. So plenty of flaws in this song, but it's also a fun one, so I'm pretty half and half with it. So here are the point totals, 45%, not really surprised at all. It's obvious that this album was front-loaded with the best material and then kind of nosedives on the B-side, except for that final track, which is strong. Maybe that was an attempt to save the album. It didn't really work, of course. I think the band knew this was not a good record. Thinking back to 1986, you have to wonder who Quiet Riot is chasing here. Obviously, Bon Jovi comes to mind. Also, the Sammy Hagar era of Van Halen. Europe had released the Final Countdown before this record, so maybe that's in the mix. And of course, Judas Priest with Turbo. I'm not necessarily sure it's accurate to say that this band merely hung their hat on the wrong rack, because if you think about it, the bands I just mentioned did really, really well for themselves with their releases, but then Quiet Riot, with this similar template, did not. I think there are some factors at play, of course. I think this is a sharp departure from their previously established sound, and we know how unforgiving us metal fans can be. Also, the songwriting just isn't as strong. I mean, you can't find a Party All Night or a Bang Your Head on this record anywhere. They just can't be found. So the flaws on this album are also worth talking about. The very restrained guitar solos really don't help. I think they're pretty obvious. Also, the synth on this album, I hate to beat a dead horse, but it's there, and it's very prominent, and it's very in the way. Also, the synth often matches or even exceeds the guitars in the mix, which is pretty off-putting. And of course, that cover art there, not exactly great. In fact, it's pretty lackluster. And of course, I'm going to repeat this again. You can't not factor in Kevin DuBro here. Everyone hated him. Again, that was everywhere. In fact, that hatred was so bad that it really negatively impacted the band. Even Rudy Sarzo left because of it. He also hated DuBro, by the way. So, there you go. Of course, if you have your own theories or insight into why this band dissolved the way they did, crashed might be more the term, you can definitely let me know in the comments. I'm up for talking about it. You know what? Yeah, let's talk about it. And that's my revisit of QR3 by Quiet Riot. Of course, if you like or hate this album, you should let me know in the comments. If you don't like this album, would you go back to it all these years later? Some people really like this album quite a bit, and I'm not going to put those folks down. I want to hear from you too. Let me know all of that in the comments below. Of course, if you're new to this channel, just to let you know, this is the Accusation Network. I do metal vinyl collecting videos once or twice a week, always on Mondays, sometimes on Thursdays. You can check in to find out. Check out my playlist, check out the videos. You should also like, subscribe, and share. I love those things. They are better than money. Wait, no, they're not. But do them anyways. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.